Ys, a game that's often mispronounced as Wise thanks to a mistranslation that put an apostrophe in between the two letters that make up its name. Ys is still around today, but I don't think it quite holds the popularity or namesake shared by its peers such as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, both of which premiered within a year of Ys. Ys is originally a legendary city that was apparently the most beautiful city in Europe before eventually being swallowed by the sea. Developers Nihon Falcom adapted this tale into a story about a young warrior named Adel Kristin and his many adventures traversing the lands of legend. The first title was released in 1987 on the PC 8801 and was probably most notable for the fact that the combat is literally characters bumping into each other. At the time, most combat was menu-driven and turn-based, with the occasional action title like Legend of Zelda sprinkled in, but Ys instead made its action combat based on walking into enemies. The idea was that you wanted to go after an enemy at a slight angle or indirect path, using only the directional pad. Now this may seem awkward at first, but you pick it up easily within the first half an hour. From a personal standpoint, I feel that it establishes a rhythm of combat that I've always enjoyed about brawlers, and integrates it into an RPG. This is most enjoyable when it comes to the tedious task of level grinding, a necessity in almost all RPGs of the 80s, and Ys is no exception. Falcom staff have said that they viewed it as turning level grinding into an arcade-like high score mechanic, and I can't disagree. Either way, it's more fun than random battles every few steps where you bang away at a single button, get your XP, and move on. Aside from its then unique combat system, Ys also had regenerating health anytime the character was in the overworld or stood still. While dungeon exploring, regenerating health was ceased, but that was only until you found the heal ring early on, and that restored this function even in dungeons. Your character would level, collect gold, wear armor, and wield stronger and stronger weapons, much like other RPGs of the time. In fact, save for the original's length and a few distinguishing features, Ys will be rather easy for a classic RPG fan to pick up and play after an initial break-in period. From the initial release on the PC 8801, Ys was ported all over the world of microcomputers and even on the Famicom before finally seeing this special release on the PC Engine CD and eventually Turbografx CD as well. While mostly bundled together today, the PC Engine CD release was the first time to my knowledge that Book 1 and 2 were brought together in late 1989. One piece of information I've been keeping from you, or rather dancing around, is that Ys is a short game by any standard. But at 4 to 6 hours, it's extremely short for an RPG, even one from the late 80s. The original adventure consists of a whopping 2 towns, one of which you start out in, and 3 dungeons in the form of a castle, a mine, and a 25-floor tower. Even more interesting is that you may spend more than half of your time in the 25-floor tower alone, especially if you don't just break down and follow a map, or even a basic walkthrough. The game is so straightforward most of the time, though, that a purist could easily decide to take notes, draw maps, and beat it the old-fashioned way in probably still less than 10 hours. While I found the original game to be fun in random battles and dungeon crawling, I must admit that I take huge issues with a majority of the boss battles. Your progress is always stifled by these enemies that have gimmicky challenges and always feel cheap. Your skills and equipment really take a backseat to your level, which can determine if each boss is a brutal challenge or a breeze. Since I wanted a balance of the two, I had to struggle to stay within stringent level numbers and still had the annoyance of facing the tougher bosses nearly a dozen times before conquering them. I will give the game credit, you will always see the large double doors right before the boss layer to remind you to save just before entering. Upon completing the game, the PC Engine CD version blends the ending of Ys and the beginning of Ys Book 2 seamlessly, with no indication other than your save files from the previous game now simply state Ys Book 1 instead of their original names. It will be impossible to give the basics of Ys Book 2 without providing a few spoilers, but these shouldn't affect your enjoyment of either game. When you complete the original Ys, Adel has just collected the 6 books, defeated Darkfact, and ascended to the floating land of Ys. Your quest in the second game is to learn more about the 6 priests that authored the books, as well as finding and eliminating the evil in Ys. Given that your journeys sound similar, and that the two are often bundled together, you may also assume that the 2 games are very similar, which really isn't the case. Ys Book 2 does take the battle system of the first game, but it enhances it with magical attacks. Magical attacks allow Adel to fight enemies from a distance and enter temporary states that change up how the game is played. I can't stress how different this game is because of magic. Although the bumping mechanic returns, magic allows you to overcome most of the foes in the game without grinding, and importing your save allows you to start at a high level for the second adventure. A magic attack can fight foes you don't want to get near, and transform allows you to communicate with the monsters you are fighting. Now, it probably wasn't the first time this had ever happened. In 1989, when Ys Book 2 released, Megaton had already released the Megami Tensei series, but it was novel nonetheless. Your traversal through the second game will be longer, more like 8 to 12 hours. And despite having more towns and many more areas than the first, Ys Book 2 is surprisingly linear compared to the first game. You won't be navigating an open world, and instead you'll find yourself walking from place to place in a larger path. Given that the first game suffered plenty of backtracking, it was refreshing to have the story constantly moving forward this time around. Not everything was improved upon, though, because I was utterly annoyed with a handful of mazes. The mine is your first dungeon, and it requires you to follow an FAQ step-by-step to traverse, which is discouraging to start the game. I did try to draw my own map, but there's just far too many eschewing cave systems for it to be worthwhile. If you're coming to the game the first time, I highly recommend just following a FAQ. Many have said that the bosses are greatly improved, but I personally disagree. Sure, your new attacks allow you to stretch out the battle and thus give you a more fighting chance, but magic is far less effective to balance this out, and boss battles still end the battle quickly with one hard hit. I also found later bosses to be a heavy burden regardless of magic. In the end, it dissolves to the original tactic of grinding up to a level where you're physically overpowered compared to your opponent and then finishing them off. I went into the game expecting this, especially just off the cuff of Ys Book 1, so while annoying, I have to admit it wasn't unexpected. In the end, Ys Book 2 becomes the heart of this package, and it seems Ys Book 1 was included purely because of the numbering mechanic and the fact that both games were only a year too old. A brief cutscene could have caught up the story in about 3 minutes, but the original does give appreciation to the legacy. It also demonstrates the various enhancements that made Falcom's sophomore effort an impressive feat less than 1 year later. It's only after playing the Duo that you can appreciate Ys in a similar vein as other JRPGs of the time. When looking over the entire package, I have to say I'm highly impressed with Ys Book 1 and 2 on the PC Engine CD, and many justifiably claim it's the best way to experience these games even today. The graphics, although somewhat simpler for the time, have a brightness and personality about them, and I have to say the bosses are especially impressive. In the PC Engine CD version, anime cutscenes with additional background info replace the bare-bones text that made up previous ports.
A country where children were as free as the wind.
The score was composed by Yuzo Koshiro, one of the most famous composers of the 8-bit and 16-bit era, and responsible for one of my favorite Genesis titles, Streets of Rage. Koshiro's original works have been arranged by Ryo Yonemitsu, and the entire score is considered one of the best RPG soundtracks of all time. As for me, I have no issue sitting back and appreciating every moment of level grinding, exploring, and boss battling thanks to a fantastic soundtrack that was only possible in part by the CD format. On a localization note, the Turbografx CD version was brought to the West and contains the most accurate and faithful translation to date. Unlike most other JRPGs, none of the names are changed, and the plot is kept entirely intact, with little differences or even subtleties between the regions. In addition, the voice acting, especially for the English version, is superb.
Are you all right? Me? I am Lilia from Rance Village. I felt a cold shiver down my spine, and I felt compelled to come in this direction.
As someone who has now heard a lot of early CD voice acting from the East, the performances aren't hokey, poorly written, or portrayed by someone who doesn't seem to speak English. The team responsible for capturing the voices should definitely be commended. I think there's little more to say about Ys Book 1 and 2 on PC Engine CD, save for the obvious fact that anyone who owns the console should pick it up and play it. As someone who has not touched the series until now, I was impressed with both the game proper and this particular version. Couple that with the excellent English localization, and it's obvious that Nihon Falcom was a leader in quality on the PC Engine CD.